very much, Christy. And thanks, Paydirt, for having us today. Look, let's see if we can convince you that value adding to critical minerals is something Australia should be undertaking. I'll skip over AMEC, what we do, but I do want to say that we represent now almost 600 companies, but about 100 of those companies are currently exploring for critical minerals. About 65 of those are somewhere in the feasibility studies process. They advanced as they advance their projects forward. About 20 of those, 15 to 20, have genuine ambitions of advancing, value-adding, as well as developing the critical minerals mines. So we represent a broad audience, but one that is quite interested and very committed to turning value-adding and realising the value from our minerals. I sort of termed this the year of strategic competition, scratched it out and thought trade or economic warfare. But I'll start back in sort of the early 2020s. If you don't know who those two blokes are, you probably haven't watched a lot of television recently, at least you don't know who one of them is. The guy on your left is Anthony Albanese, our Prime Minister. The guy on the right is Premier Li Qiang. He is essentially the number 2 guy in China, and by any accounting is probably one of the 10 most powerful and influential people on the planet. That's the two of them standing in Kings Park looking over Perth in about May of last year. So, why are they in Perth? Why has China sent such a substantial delegation here to WA? Well, the answer is they sent a Chinese delegation to Australia. The Australian government said, fantastic, let's meet in Sydney and Canberra. And the Chinese Premier said, no, we want to go to Western Australia. They said, well, all of the Australian federal governments in the eastern states, we want you to come to the eastern states. And they said, no, we want to go to Western Australia. And particularly, we want to go down and visit our company, Tianqi Lithium, and see what they're doing in terms of value adding to our lithium spodumene and creating lithium hydroxide. They essentially pulled our Prime Minister and the focus of our nation over, because lithium and critical minerals are critical to their interests and indeed where they see their economy and their processing facilities on behalf of the world moving forward. That's 2024. That's how China sees critical minerals. Now, in the last few years, what we've seen is every country in the world and every bloc start to recognise how incredibly important this is. And the way they've chosen to do that is through market interventions. Massive incentive packages that have been put on the table to try and attract this wave of investment that's going to support this energy transformation and revolution that's taking place that Luca and Dom so elegantly spoke about a minute ago. The major one of those was the United States stepping in with the Inflation Reduction Act. Over $1 trillion of incentives, tax credits and support to help attract that investment into the United States, and it worked. Under the Biden administration, they bought something like $60 billion in the first year of new investment into that critical minerals value-adding supply chain. Now, leadership's changed in the United States and strategic competition has become something a little more intense. It's now economic or trade warfare. The goal and the ambition is still the same. The way they're trying to achieve it has changed. So what Trump has done, President Trump has done, is essentially put the payments of the Inflation Reduction Act on hold, and he's brought in a range of quite significant trade and tariffs focused on every nation in the world, but presumably targeting China. Indeed, continuing that strategic competition and then battle for the economic future. Now, critical minerals seem to be equally as important. And in fact, when you see President Trump's speeches, his inauguration address addressed this directly. In his conversations about making peace in the Ukraine, critical minerals deals have been a big part of that conversation. We've also seen it more recently in his executive orders unlocking deep seabed mining in the search for critical minerals in US waters. So essentially you've got the two major powers which Australia is stuck in between, our largest trading partner, our largest strategic alliance and defence partner, essentially saying critical minerals is one of our key priorities. Now, when it comes to the tariffs issue, the United States has chosen not to put tariffs on a range of critical minerals, in fact most critical minerals. That's important. It's important because it identifies that the United States sees this as a strategic weakness where they need support. And indeed, Australia is well placed to help them meet those challenges should they decide to seek that support from Australia. So that's something worth talking about. And you'll see in terms of reciprocal tariffs, you've seen China step back into a space with trade and export restrictions around a range of critical minerals and critical minerals byproducts, which has of course only increased the interest in Australian companies and Australian projects looking at producing those products. So, I'm going to tell you what you already know. Why is this a problem? Well, because the fast comes to critical minerals, China does pretty much all the world's processing, which means everyone else further down the value chain, who may have previously been quite comfortable buying products further down the value chain to produce their advanced manufactured products, ultimately has to rely on China. If China cuts the cord or puts in a barrier that they cannot get around, then the reality is they've got a very significant supply chain vulnerability. And so consequently, this issue we've talked about for years now, since COVID, of reducing the supply chain vulnerabilities that go through China and creating a supply chain outside of China continues to be important to Western nations, and indeed they continue to help bring these conversations up with the Australian government and Australian industry. All right, so what's Australia been doing about this for a while? Well, we've been starting to invest and support our industry getting off the ground, particularly in terms of critical minerals projects. There's been a range of investments through low interest loans, through grant funds, through the 2020s as we lead up to the change of government with the Albanese government. Both the Morrison government and the Albanese government have had programs and facilities to support these developments. And quite a significant amount of money has been put on the table to help push those along. However, when it comes to the market interventions being made by the nations, the reality is what Australia's put on the table is entirely inconsequential against the money some of the nations like China and the United States are throwing at it. So if you look at this, this is basically a breakdown of the United States Inflation Reduction Act. At the top, the AMPTC is a production tax credit, which sits at about $30 billion of the $1 trillion on offer. And indeed, those payments have brought a lot of investment in the United States. So as Australia started to look around to all these market interventions, what should our response have been? Well, our argument was that we had to get into the game ourselves. Expecting the market to take care of these problems when there's been something like 1,500 market interventions, now so many tariffs put on various products and various byproducts, then the reality is a large portion of those things that we've relied on in terms of an open market and free trade, free and fair trade, and now indeed the World Trade Organisation rules have pretty much disappeared. Our choices are choose to compete or vacate the space. And given that minerals is such an important industry in Australia to benefit our prosperity and continues to underwrite our economy, we have no choice but to back in on our strengths and start to invest in those opportunities. So, with that in mind, AMEC and a range of our member companies listed there, some of you with you here today, sat down together and started to look at what we could do to suggest the Australian government to get off the sidelines and step into this space. And what we looked at initially was, what's the Americans done with the Inflation Reduction Act? What could we learn from what they've done, and how could that work here in Australia? And so essentially we chose the production tax credit as a way of advancing this idea, an idea of a 10% production tax credit that would only be payable on the success of a company producing a value-added critical mineral. Ultimately meaning there's no risk for the Australian government. If no one ever does it, doesn't cost the Australian taxpayer a cent. If companies do make that investment will massively outweigh the incentives on offer, but it offers that signal from government that we're there to support and to try and essentially make these a little more cost competitive with other nations where they've got substantial advantages in reducing the capital investment required to build these processing facilities, and indeed to encourage investment and indeed our customers to come to Australia and look at that as a place to set up value-adding operations. Now, after a significant effort 2 years ago and indeed about 12 months of advocacy, both from our members and ourselves in and around Canberra and Australia, the Albanese government committed to it as part of their Future Made in Australia, announcing a $22 billion package that looked at production tax credits for critical minerals of about $7 billion, and indeed also extended that into the hydrogen industry as well, seeking to, make more things here in Australia and back in Australian industry. So we were delighted to be successful in doing that. That has now been legislated in the Parliament this year. indeed passed through both houses and is now law, and indeed in 2027 the availability of those tax credits will come due, enabling a company to get 10 years of a 10% production tax credit. And indeed, there's a range of companies in our membership heading towards that start deadline, and indeed that program will run out to 2040. So really pleased about that, and to secured a strong signal and indeed real support for those wanting to do value adding here in this country. But it's not where it stopped. So the conversations keep going. As major nations and major economies continue to adapt to the way in which major nations are approaching these issues, Australia has to keep responding. And indeed our Prime Minister announced a response to the United States tariffs. I think we've been wise in choosing not to respond with reciprocal tariffs. There's very little for us to gain in that. We're a nation that benefits from free and fair trade. We're an export nation. We need to remain a champion of that. But equally, we've got to find ways to improve our position. One of the ideas that's been floated by AMEC and many other commentators or industry groups over the few years is to look at what you could do with the strategic reserve. What could the federal government do to support getting new projects off the ground, create a situation where we can improve our position, improve our resilience against some market manipulation that continues to happen in the critical mineral sector from big players and indeed mostly our customers. And so this idea has started to form out. What it is right now is a concept. What we know is it won't be export controls, it won't be a requirement for domestic reservation. There's nothing to fear here. What it will be is through a voluntary process where the government looks to develop a national offtake agreement and find participating companies where they would buy minerals from. Ultimately it becomes an investment and a way of which of trying to underwrite some of these currently uncommercial projects, or at least projects that aren't currently being supported by the market, to get off the ground to make sure we have access to those critical minerals, but also our strategic alliance partners do as well, if indeed in further trade negotiations or trade barriers being put in place, their access to those minerals is cut off. So I think that's an important way of thinking about our sovereign capability, what we can bring to the table with our strategic partners, particularly as tensions continue to rise. The reality is thinking more carefully about what we can do to protect our position and advance our negotiation positions, I think is very important. And indeed, when government comes to industry for consultation and design, we'll obviously work with our members to make sure we get this right and it can actually provide a boost to our local critical minerals industry. Beyond that, it's not just the Commonwealth government's got a role. State and territory governments have a role here. The West Australian government's been very supportive, trying to support our industry through difficult times, particularly as we work in, and I think Luca alluded to, going through what are shorter cycles. The ride between the peaks and the troughs these days seems to be very sharp indeed. And indeed it means being able to support our projects and keep them in the market while we're dealing with market manipulation and low price periods. There's a few things more recently. In the state election, the WA government's come to the table on our suggestions around the vanadium royalty, reducing vanadium products and vanadium pentoxide from 5% to 2.5% royalty. That's a much fairer royalty for what's being done and recognises what really is a value-adding mineral processing game in the first place. But they've also doubled down to make sure there won't be a royalty placed on vanadium electrolyte, trying to encourage companies to go that extra mile and value add further to get to a point where we can create vanadium electrolyte here in Western Australia. We're doing it now. Graham and AVL will tell you about that shortly, but also to build batteries for an industrial scale. They've committed to build a vanadium battery in Kalgoorlie in 2029 with using locally sourced vanadium. That's another important component. It creates domestic demand for the mines we hope to build. And indeed, they continue to look at other measures to support those struggling in the industry. Indeed, our lithium support package, we work with members to secure providing some loan relief and indeed working on agreements made previously by the Labor government around lithium hydroxide and making sure we've got the right royalty and economic framework here in WA to secure the investment we need and indeed give investors confidence to continue to invest here in WA. So indeed, we've got some good support there. As we continue to look at new critical minerals, more will be required and more will need to be done, but that's a place that industry's got a partner in government to work with. So look, before I close, what I'm really trying to say here is recent events make us investing and building a homegrown critical minerals industry even more important for Australia. I'm not sugarcoating it. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be very challenging. There is risk involved in doing so. But there's also a lot of value if we can be successful. It's a high-value industry. There's significant international opportunity. And although we have to contend with market innovations, maybe future tariffs and export restrictions that change the way in which our market works, our best chance is to get into this on the ground floor while this supply chain and this industry is still developing. We've got a really strong position. We've got a very capable mining industry. We have the opportunity to do this, but it does require us to back ourselves and back Australian industry. So with that in mind, I hope you'll get on board in supporting the cause. Thanks very much.